Okay, what I'd like to do in these videos is talk through some ideas from Peter Singer. Singer is one of the most famous philosophers alive today. He teaches at Princeton. He was born in Australia. He's well known as a founding contributor to the animal rights movement, sometimes also called the animal liberation movement. Singer is famously a utilitarian, so he defends basically a utilitarian morality. He fits into that camp, as we discussed in the traditional ethical theories. He fits that description. And he's also influentially argued for large-scale wealth redistribution to address global poverty. Similarly, as his arguments for animal liberation, he argues for that large-scale wealth redistribution on utilitarian grounds. So he starts from the principle of utility, the thesis that we ought to maximize pleasure and minimize pain for all of those affected by our action. And then he reasons that we ought to basically give as many, we ought to give money to address global poverty to the point where the last dollar we give hurts us more than it helps the people we're giving it to. Okay, so in other words, if I give $1 today, I have a lot of dollars. So if I give $1 to someone in a part of the world that's afflicted by global poverty, then that could feed that person for 2 or 3 days at least, and help them to be much less miserable than they otherwise will be, to be in much less pain than they otherwise would be. So that dollar costs me very little in terms of pain, but it benefits somebody else a whole lot in terms of relieving their pain. And so Singer argues that we all ought to give to the point where the last dollar we give is of equivalent value to both of us. And so, of course, that means that we ought to be giving a whole lot more than we currently are. He's also aware that we shouldn't give, we need to think about the long-term effects of our giving. So, we don't want to give so much today that we end up impoverished, on the street tomorrow and can't bring in more income to be able to give more. So we have to, bear things like that in mind too. But even bearing those things in mind, Singer, it's pretty clear that if we follow Singer's reasoning, we all ought to be giving, say, 20 or 30 or 40% or more of our income to address global poverty, to address the suffering of others, since we, almost all of us have more money than we need in that way. I realize this might not be so easy to sell to college students, because I think college students are often a little bit strapped for cash, but hopefully within a few years after your graduation, you'll be less strapped for cash. I hope so anyway. I think it's pretty reasonable to predict that. And of course, people can organize their lives in a way to be able to be more charitable, which Singer also defends and proposes. And this is an extremely controversial idea, as is his defense of animal rights or animal liberation. Singer himself is very controversial, and his talks are often protested. I'll say a little bit more about why that is. It has a lot to do with what he says about animals and humans. So Singer starts out his paper, All Animals Are Equal, from 1974, in a way that's similar to Leopold's idea of the ethical sequence. Singer talks about previous liberation movements, like women's rights, black liberation movements, LGBT rights movements, and he claims that animal liberation can be seen as a kind of next step in this evolution, or next step among these liberation movements. That it's a kind of logical, it follows in the same line, and he thinks for the same reasons as these other movements. So he says a liberation movement demands an expansion of our moral horizons and an extension or reinterpretation of the basic moral principle of equality. And he's going to focus on that idea of equality in this article. But he wants to start out immediately here after saying this by recognizing that some people may object to this. And he asks, I mean, he points out that there's a problem here. There are sort of basically two kinds of objections. One kind of objection is, hey, I find that offensive. You know, we've just now recently acquired women's rights, black liberation, civil rights, some degree of racial equality, or at least the political movements in support of some kind of racial equality, and LGBT rights. These are all very recent accomplishments. And now you want to add in animal liberation, and animals are so different from people that it just seems like it's almost like you're making fun of us. It sort of devalues or takes away the significance of the argument for women's rights and civil rights and so on. And the other kind of objection is actually wants to use animal liberation to attack these other movements. So it wants to say something like, oh, women want to vote? Well, we might as well give pigs a right to vote, okay? Which in fact was something that a author had written in the 19th century when women were arguing for the right to vote. They said, oh, well, while we're giving the right to vote to new beings, let's give it to pigs too. Let's give it to animals. And it was supposed to be a refutation of the idea, or a kind of mockery, a parody of the idea. So Singer is concerned to answer this worry, okay, both from the person who wants to defend women's rights and civil rights, and he wants to answer the person who wants to make a joke of women's rights and civil rights, because Singer doesn't think those things are a joke at all. He's fully in support of those things. He's just also in support of animal liberation. So what does he say? He needs to answer this worry that it's a parody, okay? The question, should pigs have a right to vote, which is supposedly absurd, like pigs can't vote, so what are we talking about when we're talking about animal liberation? And so here Singer does something interesting. He says, just because it makes no sense to say pigs should be able to vote, that doesn't mean that they don't have other rights, or they shouldn't have other rights, okay? So yes, pigs are not the kinds of creatures that can vote. Likewise, men are not the kinds of creatures that can have babies. So it doesn't make sense. We can talk about a woman's right to an abortion, but we can't talk about men's right to an abortion, because men can't get an abortion, okay? So what we need to do is recognize whatever it is about animals and humans that's the same, that gives them equal consideration. And we only have to extend rights as far as those things that are the same go. We don't have to extend rights to things that aren't the same, like ability to deliberate, make decisions, push a lever in favor of your preferred candidate, and so on, basically voting, okay? So the way that Singer summarizes this, and incidentally, this reply also explains why it does make sense to say that women and racial minorities and so on should have a right to vote, is because there's no relevant difference that means that a woman can't make a good decision about a candidate, or a racial minority can't make a good decision about a candidate. Humans have the capacity to reflect, deliberate, and make a choice about how they want society to be, and all humans have that ability. So even though no pigs have that ability, all humans have that ability, and that fact that humans have that ability means we should recognize that for humans and extend that right to all humans. And so Singer then summarizes this point by saying the basic principle of equality, I should argue, he just means by that he is going to argue, or he is arguing. The basic principle of equality is equality of consideration. And equal consideration for different beings may lead to different treatment and different rights. So he's got to say more now about what this equality of consideration is.